invasion begins. Operation Barbarossa had already collapsed in principle long before a single German soldier stepped across the Soviet frontier. For with the limited options available to Germany's political and military leadership in 1941, and in the complete absence of a coherent, achievable strategic objective, a war against the Soviet Union was destined to fail from the moment it was conceived. It was the monstrous collision between two dominant ideologies of the age, fascism and communism, meeting head-on with every ounce of manpower, steel, fuel, and fury that each side could summon. It became a war of conquest, a war of criminal aggression, a war violating every standard of international law, and ultimately a war of annihilation driven by the racial fanaticism of National Socialism. People throughout the Soviet Union immediately understood that Hitler's regime had launched a war intended to eradicate them entirely. There could be no negotiation, no compromise, for compromise meant death. Right from the outset, the operation was saturated with criminal intention. What made Barbarossa uniquely horrifying was that morality, restraint, and law were deliberately discarded. The plan, if one could call it a plan, amounted only to the vague notion that Germany would strike the Soviet Union, seize Moscow, and assume victory would simply materialize. Such thinking was detached from reality to a staggering degree. German forces pushed forward with such reckless haste that they left signposts in place along the roads they abandoned, mute reminders of the arrogance and brutality with which they advanced and later retreated. On August 23, 1939, a German aircraft touched down in Moscow. Stalin sent his own armored limousine to retrieve Hitler's foreign minister, Joachim von Ribbentrop. What followed, the signing of the Hitler-Stalin Pact, shook the world. Imagine the surreal sight. The two greatest ideological enemies of the century, Bolshevism and National Socialism, suddenly embracing one another after years of venomous propaganda. This propaganda had been vicious on both sides, filled with accusations, slander, and hatred poured across Europe from Nazi channels and from the Comintern alike. Then, with one signature, the bitter enemies stood allied. The German-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact declared that neither nation would support or assist the other's foes. Hidden in a secret protocol was the agreement to redraw the borders of Eastern Europe. The pact shocked governments worldwide, yet it was an extraordinarily shrewd tactical maneuver for both dictatorships. Each regime bought the one resource Hitler and Stalin valued most: time. Hitler gained time to wage his campaign in the West. Stalin gained time to rearm, rebuild, and reorganize his military. And both had agreed, implicitly and explicitly, to divide Eastern Europe between them. The pact cleared the way for Hitler's invasion of Poland. Even before German operations concluded, Soviet troops swept into eastern Poland. German Wehrmacht and Soviet Red Army units met at Brest-Litovsk, carving up a nation between them. Under the pact, Nazi Germany received vast quantities of Soviet food supplies and critical raw materials. By May 1940, the Wehrmacht felt powerful enough to strike at France and the Western Allies. Within mere weeks, France was crushed and forced to seek an armistice. Hitler emerged believing himself to be a master of modern warfare. The myth of the Blitzkrieg was born. Yet Hitler was far from an unintelligent man. He had risen from nothing and clawed his way into absolute power. Through bitter experience, he had studied crowds, deception, mass psychology, and manipulation. From this, he forged an ideology divorced from reality, yet he knew when to adjust it for tactical advantage.
Up to 1940, this ruthless flexibility had delivered victory after victory. On July 6, 1940, Hitler returned triumphantly to Berlin. He had already decided that after defeating Britain, he would turn to his true obsession, the conquest of the Soviet Union. That same day, General Franz Halder wrote in his war diary that it was time to establish the political and military basis for the General Staff's future work. But by then, Hitler's decision was final. Lebensraum in the East, the expansion of German territory across Eastern Europe, had always been his ultimate goal. Under his orders, detailed planning began. Different branches of the armed forces explored their own scenarios. For years, even in the early 1930s, the German military had speculated about a war in the East. Now these ideas crystallized under the force of Hitler's command. On July 31, 1940, Hitler gathered his most senior officers and formally announced his intention to invade the Soviet Union in the following spring. By this stage, Hitler's authority was absolute. Even those who doubted him did not dare challenge him. Franz Halder, chief of the Army General Staff, was tasked with shaping the operation. The detailed planning was placed in the hands of Major General Friedrich Paulus. Both Halder and Paulus became instruments in converting Hitler's ideological fantasies into military orders. The tragedy was that their professional focus blinded them to the catastrophic consequences of Hitler's worldview. Paulus was one of the leading staff officers developing the earliest concepts of the operation, still unnamed at that time. Meanwhile, the various arms of the German military, the Army, Navy, Air Force, and the overall High Command, each drafted their own plans. These were compiled and presented to Hitler on December 5, 1940. 1 week earlier, Paulus had presented an initial war game scenario, a lightning-fast armored breakthrough intended to prevent Soviet forces from retreating into the enormous hinterland. Even then, Barbarossa was only one option among many. Germany's leadership remained focused on defeating Britain. Three concerns dominated strategic planning: the air war over Britain, the Atlantic naval campaign, and operations in the Mediterranean. Barbarossa existed in parallel, not yet the singular priority.
But by December 1940, Hitler accelerated preparations. The invasion became certain. He willingly stepped into the two-front nightmare he had once vowed to avoid. Directive number 21, Operation Barbarossa, laid out Hitler's true vision: the destruction of the Soviet state and the conquest of a massive expanse stretching from Arkhangelsk to Astrakhan. After the Red Army was crushed, all remaining Soviet forces were to be driven beyond the Ural Mountains. Their land would become German colonial territory. This ideological vision shaped the Wehrmacht strategy. Though reckless, the invasion seemed tempting. German commanders perceived the Soviet Union as poorly led, chaotic, and fragile, a giant with feet of clay. Many believed that after a few crushing blows, the Red Army would disintegrate. Halder wrote that the operation was meaningful only if the Russian state is destroyed in one swift strike. The plan depended on obliterating the Soviet armed forces near their western border before retreat was possible. Blitzkrieg was the method: overwhelming armored thrusts designed to encircle enormous Soviet formations. Yet Germany's generals knew, or should have known, that the Soviet Union possessed one of the largest armies on Earth. They underestimated it catastrophically. The Red Army's poor performance in the 1939-40 Winter War against Finland encouraged this arrogance. Despite the bravery of Soviet troops, they suffered enormous losses due to inadequate leadership, lack of winter gear, and insufficient automatic weapons. German generals used this as proof that the Soviets could not fight effectively. But they ignored the overwhelming size of the Soviet Union and the limitless potential of its mobilization. Even in 1941, German planners had no unified strategic goal. In the Soviet Union, the Hitler-Stalin relationship was believed to be permanent.
Stalin considered their mutual blood pact unbreakable. Hitler thought otherwise. German planners supported Hitler's ambitions, blinded by their own arrogance toward Slavic peoples. In January 1941, Halder wrote that the objectives of Barbarossa remained unclear, yet preparations continued. The military's traditional obedience drove them on. By early June 1941, units across Germany prepared to move east. In Paderborn, a supply unit led by Lieutenant Gottfried Bugelmann, a young officer and amateur cinematographer, prepared to depart. His footage captured the eager mood of soldiers unaware of the nightmare ahead. He and his men were heading into a war of extermination whose full scale few could have imagined. Living space in the East had long existed as an idea in German political discourse, but under Hitler it became something far more extreme, the eradication of entire peoples. Throughout the 1930s, Hitler had repeated his plans so obsessively that by 1941, anyone who understood his words knew the war would be genocidal. Nazi propaganda films like The Soviet Paradise revealed their intentions openly, the extermination of tens of millions of Slavs. Barbarossa was conceived as a war of annihilation, engineered to depopulate Soviet lands and replace the Slavic population with Germans. In Nazi racial ideology, Soviet citizens were less than human, obstacles to be removed. Bugelmann's unit crossed Germany by train to East Prussia, where the invasion was set to begin on June 22, 1941. Their task was to maintain the supply lines for the fighting divisions. Propaganda prepared the troops with lies about Soviet plans for aggression. Goebbels himself delivered the declaration announcing the supposed Soviet conspiracy that justified the invasion. The Wehrmacht deployed 153 divisions. The Red Army had 237. Barbarossa could succeed only if the Soviets were encircled early before they could flee to the east. Blitzkrieg was essential. Fast armored thrusts, swift encirclements, decisive victories. Yet the Soviet Union was too vast to be conquered quickly. Nonetheless, German leaders still believed victory would come within 6 to 8 weeks. Nazi newsreels showed German forces crossing from East Prussia into Soviet territory with confidence. In truth, five massive German thrusts smashed across a 2,000-mile front from the Arctic north to the Black Sea in the south. Nearly 2 million Axis soldiers stepped into Soviet territory, convinced of swift triumph. But beneath this veneer of confidence, one fact remained. Germany had entered a war it could never win. Firestorm in the East. The German General Staff understood perfectly well that the war had to be short. Germany lacked the resources to sustain a prolonged conflict, even though Hitler believed that sheer German superiority would eventually crush the Soviets. Thus, operational planning remained completely fixated on a rapid victory, and the target at the center of that belief was Moscow. Whether capturing the Soviet capital would have truly changed the outcome remains uncertain, but the dispute between Hitler and his senior officers revolved entirely around this crucial point. In the early days of the invasion, the head of the General Staff, Franz Halder, wrote in his war diary, "The enemy appears tactically surprised everywhere." The assault became a massive collision of two very different armies, the modernized, battle-seasoned Wehrmacht and the Red Army, which, despite its size, lacked critical experience. The Wehrmacht had been fighting continuously for almost 2 years, sharpening its offensive power. Along the old Soviet border, the defensive lines of bunkers and fortifications held up the German advance for days, causing heavy German losses that Nazi propaganda carefully concealed. Despite their numerical strength, Red Army troops lacked experienced leaders. The purges of the late 1930s had wiped out nearly the entire command structure, leaving the army with young officers who had hardly any frontline experience and often no idea what was unfolding. Soviet doctrine demanded that battles be fought outside Soviet territory on foreign ground. The Soviets believed that by pushing everything forward to the border, they would keep the war out of their homeland. Instead, this created the exact circumstances the Wehrmacht needed. German armored wedges, supported by relentless Stuka dive bombers, punched deep into Soviet lines. Bugelmann captured his own version of the advance with his 16mm camera as the German units rolled deeper into Russia. As the only surviving son in his family, he had been kept out of direct frontline duty and was attached to a supply unit, yet even from the rear he witnessed the relentless movement east. His unit struggled to keep up with the pace of Army Group Center, which surged ahead through Belarus and into the heart of the Ukraine. Stops were brief, hurried, and immediately followed by deeper penetration into Soviet territory. The villages and towns they encountered were unprepared for the devastation that arrived with the Wehrmacht. German troops took whatever they needed, food, livestock, supplies, destroying any hope the civilians had of survival. Many Ukrainians initially saw the Germans as liberators from Stalin's terror, but they quickly learned the truth. The Wehrmacht's beating looted everything, leaving the population destitute.
Bugelmann's unit played its own part in this. Tasked with supplying the 9th Armored Division, they helped fuel the machinery of destruction. Tanks and armored vehicles, which formed the spearheads, were critical for rapid encirclements, the centerpiece of German strategy. But the image of a fully mechanized, unstoppable German army was illusion. In 1941, the Wehrmacht still depended on horses as much as it did on trucks. There were roughly 600,000 motor vehicles, but also 600,000 horses, the true backbone of the army's mobility. By mid-July, Bugelmann's unit paused briefly near the town of Nizhin in the Chernihiv Oblast, a settlement with centuries of history. Only 3 weeks after the invasion began, it fell to German forces. The roads were brutal, dirt paths that turned to thick dust in the heat and mud in the rain. Trucks constantly sank, broke down, or overheated. Villagers, under German orders, often had to help push them free. These scenes foreshadowed the logistical disaster Germany would face within months. But in summer 1941, the Wehrmacht still pushed forward like a storm. According to Barbarossa's design, the armored thrusts were to advance toward Leningrad, Smolensk, and Kyiv. Meanwhile, vast Soviet armies would be encircled and annihilated. The early encirclement battles were enormously successful because they mirrored old German military doctrine: attack, outflank, surround, destroy. German tanks spearheaded deep advances, closing enormous pincer movements. Then the slower infantry and horse-drawn units arrived to complete the trap. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers were captured. An amateur cameraman moving with the 6th Panzer Regiment photographed the aftermath at Kyiv after the city fell. 3 factors explained the staggering number of Soviet prisoners in the early months. First, German shock tactics ruptured Soviet lines and sealed off gigantic pockets. Second, Soviet officers were inexperienced and overwhelmed. Many had no idea of the broader situation. Third, Soviet tactics forbade retreat. Soldiers were ordered to stand and fight, even when encirclement was certain. 8 years of Nazi propaganda had conditioned German soldiers to see their enemies not as fellow soldiers, but as racially inferior beings. Captured Red Army troops were mocked, beaten, starved, and denied basic humanity. Temporary holding grounds filled with starving men. Forced marches stretched for hundreds of kilometers. Countless prisoners died along the road. Survivors described trails lined with bodies. Men who collapsed were shot or left where they fell. Those who reached open-air camps found no shelter, food, or water. German soldiers hurled scraps of bread into crowds of thousands as entertainment, while the prisoners fought desperately for the crumbs. This was exactly what German leadership had intended. The Wehrmacht made no supply provisions for Soviet POWs. Starvation was the plan.
One of the most grotesque spectacles occurred when starving prisoners dug holes in the earth with their bare hands for shelter. German soldiers watched, laughing, believing they were witnessing proof of Soviet inferiority, when in reality they were witnessing the consequences of deliberate cruelty. In August 1941, Joseph Goebbels personally toured a POW camp near Riesa to inspect the subhumans his propaganda had demonized. Meanwhile, Hitler's high command issued the notorious Barbarossa decree on May 13, 1941, before the operation even began. It declared that crimes by German soldiers against Soviet civilians would not be prosecuted. It also allowed German officers to execute civilians based on suspicion alone. This decree, combined with the Commissar Order, which mandated the immediate execution of all Soviet political commissars, made Barbarossa a criminal war from the first moment. Political commissars were easily identified by the special insignia on their sleeves. They were to be shot on sight. Their status as soldiers was stripped away. International law did not apply to them. The order created chaos and encouraged indiscriminate killing. Many German officers objected only because they feared it would provoke Soviet troops to fight harder. They worried, correctly, that commissars, knowing death awaited them, would resist to the last breath, refusing surrender. Yet few objected on moral grounds. Many felt communists and Jews deserved no mercy. After the Wehrmacht captured Liepāja in Latvia, mass executions began almost immediately. Red Army soldiers, communists, and nearly the entire Jewish population, around 7,000 people, were murdered. By chance, a man named Marine Richard Wiener filmed one of the massacres. On August 15th, Heinrich Himmler himself attended a mass execution near Minsk. Reportedly, he turned pale at the sight of the slaughter. But afterward, he declared that such actions, though difficult, were necessary. The Wehrmacht's advance created the space needed for the SS death squads, Einsatzgruppen, to carry out mass murder. Cooperation between the Army and SS was smooth and systematic. The Army provided transportation, supplies, manpower, blocking units, flamethrowers, and explosives. Troops stood guard while entire communities were wiped out. The myth of a clean Wehrmacht was born after the war, but it is a lie. The Army was deeply complicit. As the Wehrmacht advanced deeper into the Soviet Union, soldiers began to feel overwhelmed by the endless expanse. The Soviet Union seemed without limit. Despite massive casualties, the Red Army fought back ferociously. German losses soared. The blitzkrieg machine that had crushed Poland and France was now burning itself out on the vast plains of Russia. By mid-August 1941, German casualties reached over 200,000. The 6th Panzer Regiment suffered massive losses, but Nazi propaganda still trumpeted victory. German euphoria was blinding. After only 2 weeks of success, Franz Halder, supposedly the most rational of Germany's military planners, wrote that no war in history had ever been won